Okay, welcome to the Berggruen Forum, everyone. Just two announcements. Next week's Berggruen Forum will be Kathy Sherman, who is the Certification and Placement Officer in the Division of Education, and she is giving a talk entitled Books, Battles and Beliefs, Teaching US History in the Era of Fake News. She's a valued community member, and please come and spread the word. Tomorrow, 7:30 in Miller, the AU Symphony Orchestra is giving a concert, and so that's another important thing to be aware of. Today, we're very happy to have Jonathan Ziese, Assistant Professor of Theatre, giving a talk titled Content Warnings in the Theatre.
All right, thank you very much, Emrys. Thank you. Thank you all for joining here in person, and for those of you who are joining over Zoom. Gives me an opportunity to be mic'd up. I'm not used to that, but since this is traveling through the internet, I'm doing that. So today I'm going to talk to you about content warnings in the theater. It is a discussion that is ongoing. It is current, and not just in theater, in certainly academia and other places as well. So I think that as you know, existing at the intersection of two places where content warnings are being hotly debated, this would be a good thing for me to talk about. But before continuing, let's get a definition out of the way here. I'm defining for the purposes of this, right? This is defined by me, an expert. A statement given prior to a performance that discloses to the audience that content therein may elicit a strong and/or potentially harmful emotional, psychological, or physiological response, typically including descriptors of such content, right? But we all kind of know what these content warnings are. A whole bunch of theater companies, theater organizations, schools that produce theater have in recent years developed standards and guidelines for putting content warnings out. This is becoming more and more common practice, but there has been a debate that has been raging in response. And in some cases, rage is the appropriate verb. Daily Telegraph is an example, or a couple of examples of pushback. Content warnings are attack on theater's reason to exist, right? Forbes magazine had an article, Perpetuate Victimhood, The Atlantic, The Real Problem. Washington Post, give my disregards to Broadway's over-the-top theater trigger warnings. There are very strong feelings about whether or not trigger or content warnings are appropriate or even damaging or even helpful. And there is also a counter response, a lot of strong feelings on the other side as well, right? When you oppose them, you're really saying your trauma doesn't matter to me, according to this person. So it is a current debate throughout theater, but even more specifically, the theater departments and performance design and technology departments in preparing for the season, preparing for the plays that we were producing this particular spring, this became more relevant because certainly one, but in some ways both of the plays that we were planning to produce, one of them we pivoted to a different play, but they are certainly plays that invite this sort of discussion. And so in researching and thinking about this, I found myself trying to decide where I stood on whether or not content warnings were appropriate, whether they should become standard practice. And then I realized I had to decide that also for this talk. Because if I give a content warning at the front, at the top, that would kind of give up the game. But if I don't, that would also give up the game. So I'm going to hedge, I'm going to punt on that. Because a lot of, pardon me, because I can't talk about content warnings without talking about content, really. It's gonna be in text and just spoken, there's nothing potentially visually. But when I'm researching this, I really am of two minds, I can't decide. The plays, one of the plays that we were going to produce, Cleansed by Sarah Kane, important name in this kind of arena. That particular play has a lot of brutal confrontational in to a conventional audience, things that are put on stage, right? There are needles being injected into someone's eye. There is graphic depictions of sex to completion on stage. There is surgery on genitals on stage. These sorts of things. So we were debating whether content warning would be appropriate for these. And the play that I directed called Rich Bitch by Rachel Lynette, it does not have as much on stage. There is a moment of physical violence on stage. And of the 8 scenes in the play, only one of them does not have drinking in it. It takes place at a bachelorette party, if you haven't seen it. But the language specifically, and what these characters talk about do run into potential areas where a content warning might be appropriate. Just in terms of profanity, the word shit is said 26 times or some variation of it. Words ass and suck 6 times. The word fuck or variations of it is said 88 times in the play, which, timing the play to 1 hour and 45 minutes, comes to the F-bomb being dropped every minute and 12 seconds on average. So language would certainly be a potential content advisory. I wanted also to, kind of as a sidebar, Sarah Kane was one of a number of playwrights coming out of England. They produced plays in the 1990s who had this similar aesthetic of putting kind of brutal things on stage, depicting things on stage, not alluding to them, papering over them, covering them up or anything, but they were very much in your face, which is the name that has been attached to this particular aesthetic. Even in other media around the same time in the early 90s, right? That is when like grunge music, Nirvana, like Nevermind came out in 91, so did Blood Sugar Sex Magic. In video games, Mortal Kombat and Doom both came out in the early 90s, so did the premiere of Beavis and Butthead. So this is of a certain kind of movement across the culture. And because of the early 90s attachment to this, notice the color scheme. It's a very kind of like early to mid 90s color scheme. And I did my research on that. These were 2 teams that were inducted into the NBA in 1995. So why am I not using the word trigger warning? Why am I talking about content warnings instead? A couple of reasons. The first is that when you talk about triggers, that denotes really a relationship to PTSD. When you read the DSM-5 and it talks about the guidelines for diagnosis of PTSD, it mentions things that we would describe as being triggering events. One is intense or prolonged psychological distress at exposure to internal or external cues that symbolize or resemble an aspect of the traumatic event, or also marked physiological responses to such things. And so trigger has a very narrow, relatively narrow in this context, scope. And content is certainly broader. There are things that I would not want my 5-year-old to see necessarily, but it's not because they would trigger some memory of a past traumatic event, but because of the content. And there's another argument that says that having a trigger warning, even calling it that in respect to PTSD, is not exactly appropriate either, because triggers are individualized to each person. The determinant of what is and what is not a trigger does not belong within the purview of the artist. A trigger belongs, in many senses, it is determined within the audience member. And so I do not know as an artist what triggers I have, but I do know and I can control what content I have. And so there's even that kind of debate. So how do they look like? Or what do they look like, right? This is an example from the Denver Center for the Performing Arts. Please be advised, production contains strobe lights, loud noises, fog, scenes of violence, adult language, sexual situations, which is kind of hard to say 5 times fast, and adult humor and content. I want to point out, at the top, it does not say content warning. It does not say trigger warning. These kind of content advisories do not actually have to have the nomenclature in order to function as content warnings. So just so you know, I am describing a type of communication, not necessarily the specific words that are used in that communication. And this is in the lobby of the particular theater, right? Obviously, before people go in. Content warnings are also given very commonly in promotional materials. You can go to a particular website and find content warnings. This particular group, Gray A, is a UK theater group that specializes in theater with deaf, disabled, and neurodivergent artists as well. They did a production of Blasted at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Arts, and they say, specifically, this play contains multiple references, descriptions of sexual assault, rape, and child abuse, coercion, racist language, homophobic, misogynist language, strong violence, a deceased infant, smoking and alcohol use, war, descriptions of torture, references to murder and genocide, bombs, suicide, cannibalism, and full frontal nudity. And having seen that play, not this production, but having seen that play, that is all absolutely true. It is absolutely true. There is one scene in particular that, I mean, there's this kind of content throughout, but one scene in particular, which is my favorite kind of sequence in the play, illustrates this well. The play revolves around two people, Ian and Kate. Ian has just been, a bomb has gone off. He's a war reporter in a war zone. He has just been raped by a soldier and had his eyes sucked out. The soldier shoots himself, commits suicide. And Ian's in a bad way. So Kate, his only companion, leaves. Darkness, light, Ian masturbating, saying cunt a lot. Darkness, light, Ian strangling himself. Darkness, light, Ian shitting and trying to clean it up with a newspaper. Darkness, light, Ian laughing hysterically. Darkness, light, Ian having a nightmare. Darkness, light, Ian crying huge bloody tears and hugging the soldier's body for comfort. Darkness, light, lying very still, weak with hunger. Darkness, light, tears the cross out of the ground, rips up the boards, and lifts the baby's body out. He eats the baby. He puts the sheet the baby was wrapped in back in the hole. A beat, he climbs it after and lies down, head poking out of the floor. Dies with relief. Starts to rain on him coming through the roof. Eventually, shit, he says. And then Kate enters, carrying some bread, a large sausage, and a bottle of gin, blood seeping from between her legs. And so the content advisory is very specific, right? Very specific. Cannibalism of a deceased infant. Certainly, you don't see that very often. And so content warnings can be very specific. They can also be relatively general about a show as well. Seattle Public Theater produced the Thanksgiving play contains white privilege, right? As yes, and yes, I was wondering what this was about too. Larissa Fasthorse, a member of the Sikangu Lakota Nation, she writes plays with Native American characters in it, but was told by a producer that they were hard to produce because there are no Native actors. There are, I know many of them, but she was told that anyway. And so she challenged herself to write a play that dealt with Native issues and representation and inclusion, but with only white people in it. And so the play that she wrote has 4 characters trying to create a play about Thanksgiving while attempting to be kind of culturally sensitive and inclusive. One of the 4 was actually hired by the other 3 thinking that she was Native. She's not. She was just a darker skinned white person. Comedy, right? But white privilege there throughout. Creed Repertory Theater has a trigger warning for Cinderella, saying that there is description of prejudice toward people living in poverty, presumably Cinderella herself. Right? So these are examples of content warnings or trigger warnings as how they exist in the wild. Right? So how am I going to proceed? So like I said, I am of 2 minds of this. And when I would read arguments for and research arguments against, I found myself agreeing a lot with people that I read because there's very good arguments on either side. So I thought, why not make a little bit of theatricality in it and kind of do a debate against myself. Right. So I'm going to frame it in apologies to people who know philosophy and not a lay person, right? Of what a conception of Hegelian dialectic would be. I would propose a thesis. Content warnings should be standard practice in the theater. And afterward, I would propose an antithesis. Content warnings should not, absolutely not be standard practice in the theater. Maybe at the end, there will be some sort of ground for a synthesis of those two. Maybe not. Who knows? But now I'm going to put on my in favor hat. Content warnings absolutely should be standard practice in the theater. Because of values surrounding things like transparency, consent, care, and safety. All of these are extremely important, and artists have a responsibility to the audience to not harm them, for one, which is the first thing. We don't want to hurt people. Just plainly, we do not want to hurt people. If we believe that PTSD is real, which it is, and if we put potential triggers for PTSD on stage, which we will, and we don't want to bar people with disabilities from our plays, which we wouldn't and is also illegal, then we have to grapple with, at some point, our plays will have some sort of trigger for someone with PTSD in the audience. That just will happen. According to the National Institutes of Health, at any time, 3.6% of American adults have PTSD. And 6.8% of American adults have PTSD at some point in their lifetimes, right? The percentage of Americans who are redheads is 2%, right? So more people are walking around with PTSD than are walking around with red hair. And for a number of these people, this is a medical issue. It is almost like an allergy in some senses of the word. When my wife was pregnant with our first child, she loves mint chocolate chip ice cream, and so do I, but is also allergic to coconut. And I went around to a whole bunch of stores looking for mint chocolate ice cream that did not have coconut on it. A lot do, for some reason. Baskin-Robbins does not, though. And I was grateful that they had a content disclosure on the back of all of these, because I did not want to bring home something and have my wife eat something that would make her sick. And analogous to other medical situations like PTSD, it makes a lot of sense. There is a play called Shopping and Fucking by Mark Ravenhill, written in 1996. It contains this particular scene. It's toward the end-ish of the play. Gary is hired by Robbie, Mark, and Lulu essentially to enact, to play the role of an abusive stepfather of his. He's paying them for it. Gary, incidentally, in this play is 14 years old. He tells Mark, or allows Mark to believe that he is 16, which is the age of consent in the UK, but everyone knows he's 14 before this scene takes place. And so after Robbie is done having sex with Gary, Mark goes through the same routine, spitting and penetrating Gary. He fucks him viciously. Mark, fuck you, fuck you. Are you him? Are you my dad? Mark says, no. Yes, you're my dad, says Gary. I told you no. He hits Gary, pulls away. Gary says, Ziese, I know who you are, so finish it. Mark says, no, and then hits him repeatedly. This is absolutely the type of thing that if someone does have a trauma of being abused when they were a kid, could absolutely qualify as something that resembles or symbolizes a traumatic event. And so for that reason, if you're putting on this kind of play, you may want to have a content advisory. Even going past triggers specifically, in general, we value transparency and recognizes the audience's interest in being able to decide what kinds of media they consume. And I put consume up there because this line of thinking does acknowledge that many people who come to the theater as consumers, right? They are purchasing an experience. That might not be what theoreticians want, but it is what happens. And there's nothing wrong with that, really. When I was a kid, when I was in elementary school, I went to sleepaway church camp. Yay. And one of the games that we played was called Romans and Christians, right? It was essentially like a big game of hide and seek, right? A number of people were designated the Christians, some were designated the Romans, and like the Christians would hide and the Romans would come and try to like get them to recant their Christianity, and they'd say no. And then like, you know, there was like a bonfire at the end where everyone was like singing camp songs with the counselors and the guitar. Having that experience, I read a play. There's a play by Roswitha of Gondersheim. She wrote this in the 10th century, right? Somewhere between like 950 and 960. She's a German nun. Yay. And she wrote a story about a family. Sapientia is the mother, and her delightfully medievally named daughters, Faith, Hope, and Charity. And they are being questioned by the Emperor Hadrian, right, of the Roman Empire, trying to get them to recant their Christianity. So thematically, in terms of plot, that seems a lot like the children's game that I played. However, what you actually find in this play is very, very different. Hadrian tells Antiochus, his kind of right-hand stooge, tell them to cut the nipples off her breasts. The shame will cow her. Faith, who is 12, you have wounded my pure breast, but you have not hurt me. And look, instead of blood, a stream of milk gushes from my wounds. Hadrian says, put her on a gridiron and let fire be placed beneath so that she may be roasted to death. She's executed. And her younger sister, who is 10, Hope, is pressured by Hadrian. And he says, let her be suspended in the air and lacerated with nails until her bowels gush forth and the skin is stripped from her bones. Break her to pieces limb by limb. Medieval. Not something that would be appropriate to me when I was in elementary school, the same ages of these characters, even though it would not, again, trigger a traumatizing, recall a traumatizing event. It would still be important to know because a descriptor of what the plot is about would not tell you, but it is absolutely essential to know. Even aside from these, we want to build trust with our audience through demonstrating concern for them. A content warning is a signal to everyone who sees it that the theater practitioners recognize, yes, mental health matters. Yes, it is effective. It does affect people. And we understand that and recognize it and are taking steps to make sure that we do not harm anyone. Even if someone is perfectly fine, hey, give me all the content you want, this would still help us build a connection to them. One of the earliest examples of this sort of content warning is actually within the script of A Midsummer Night's Dream, where these mechanicals are putting on a play for the aristocracy, right? And one of them comes out dressed like a lion and says before the action of the play actually starts, you ladies, you whose gentle hearts do fear the smallest monstrous mouse that creeps on floor, may now perchance both quake and tremble here when lion rough in wildest rage doth roar. Then know that I, one snug the joiner, am a lion fell, nor else no lion's dam. For if I should, as lion, come in strife into this place, 'twere pity on my life. To which Theseus responds, a very gentle beast of a good conscience. And Demetrius, the very best of a beast, my lord, that e'er I saw. So not only does Snug come out and, with a little bit of misogyny, say, hey, ladies, I know you're scared of mice, but when I roar as a lion, just remember that I'm an actor. Theseus mentions the conscience, saying that it is a good thing and shows care and conscience of the lion to do this. We also, in kind of a meta-theatrical way, want to encourage discussion of the material's relationship to the audience themselves. By putting the content warning out there, it shows that the experience is not the play. There is a difference between having a conversation where someone says, this was bad, or this was disgusting, and them saying, this play disgusted me, which recognizes the subjectivity of the experience and separates the feelings that the audience has in the audience, or that the audience has in the moment, to their later assessment of the material. One example of this could be, there is a Scottish theater group called BADAC, B-A-D-A-C, who tag themselves as Extreme Political Art. On their website, they have what functions as a content warning, but is actually dressed up like a series, or within a series of press releases. It says, the factory is an immersive piece that follows the final journey of victims destined to die in the gas chambers of Auschwitz-Birkenau. The audience were locked into the venue and then led through the various spaces while experiencing the undressing and gassing processes used within the camp. Mixed in with the company's actors, audience members were screamed at, abused, and brutalized by guards the whole process being designed to disorient and unnerve the participants. And so with a content warning beforehand, knowing that it is purposeful and part of the artistic experience to be unnerved and disoriented and to be screamed at and to be abused will allow the space and kind of prime the pump for recognizing that that experience is not the play itself. And even though I had an extremely negative experience while watching it, that may mean that it was effective and good. Perhaps it might leave that space. Additionally, we don't like being sued. Frankly. In US v. Mater, there is a sentence in there. Consent is a well-established defense to simple assault. Now, in many states, assault, the crime of assault needs to happen with physical touch, but not all. Some states say that fear of imminent bodily harm can qualify toward simple assault. And having a content warning beforehand, if a judge looks at that, and I'm not a lawyer, I'm not dispensing legal advice here, but a judge may look at that and say, look, you knew about this beforehand, you still went, it is obviously consensual, get out of my courtroom. And that, I think, is a important reason why a lot of theater companies do this. Just a, cover your butt type of thing. In many cases, the fear needs to be reasonable, right? There's a reasonableness standard of the fear of immediate bodily harm. And juries may be more likely to say it would be unreasonable to literally fear for your bodily harm if you were told beforehand that it's going to happen. Content warnings also emphasize that depiction is not endorsement. Right? There is a play called Mercury by Stephen Ridley. This is an image from the New Group's performance in 2015. It centers around two brothers in this kind of post-apocalyptic dystopian East End of London, where the way they make money is organizing parties for a wealthy customer. What the parties actually are is it revolves around the torture and murder of a child whose name in the script is the party piece, in which the two brothers are paid for it. Now, when this play was first published or attempted to be published, Stephen Ridley's usual publisher said, no, we're not going to publish this because of its terrible content. He finally got it published, and when it was put up, some critics said that this is sick, this is twisted. We are watching Stephen Ridley's perverse sexual fetishes on stage. Now, with distance between that, perhaps recognizing that depicting this world and putting up a world where certain things are normal might not be that we think that it is normal. It puts a little bit of that analytical distance between the two. Additionally, and all of these have been focused on the audience, also it might be good for us because we want to prepare ourselves. Going through the process of looking at content that may be triggering or harmful will necessitate preparing for potential negative feedback, right? Because forewarned is forearmed in many cases. There is a play called Slave Play by Jeremy O. Harris, which Frank Shank of The Hollywood Reporter said it's the sort of production for which trigger warnings were invented. The first few scenes take place at a slave-era Southern plantation. And the first scenes involve interactions between mixed-race couples. They're not couples, but duos that end in various sex acts. Now, of course, within these scenes, the N-word is thrown around. There's a lot of threats of violence. There's a lot of degradation, these sorts of things. The director, though, said in the lead up and being prepared for this, we were in control of the narrative. We had much more control of the images we gave out to press and the story we were telling. We knew the criticisms and we knew the different fault lines of the play. So for them, knowing exactly what reactions could happen going through that process helped them in their publicity of the play itself. The play, incidentally, does not actually take place in slavery era South. There are two people in contemporary clothes who come out at the end of these first couple scenes, and you learn that this is essentially a sex therapy retreat for couples with individuals suffering from ahedonia, right, the inability to feel pleasure, trying to dig down and unlock that. And so slave play takes on a different meaning. Instead of being a play about slaves, it is an activity that these couples are engaging in, slave play. So those are all the reasons why I think that content warnings absolutely should. There's other reasons too, but these are, I think, the most persuasive reasons why. So don't listen to the other guy. Content warnings absolutely should not be common practice in the theater. They shouldn't. How dare you think otherwise? Because of values surrounding things like artistic voice, integrity, freedom of interpretation, and honestly, effectiveness. The first thing is we don't want to encourage avoidance. Great theater thinkers, playwrights, practitioners throughout history have emphasized theater exists to change. It exists to shake people up, right? Antonin Artaud talks about shaking an organism to its foundations and leaving an ineffaceable scar, right? Lynn Nottage replaced judgment with curiosity. If you have a content warning, that is a judgment, not just allowing judgment, but it is a judgment about how it will affect somebody, instead of being curious about how, right? Brecht said it's not a mirror, but a hammer with which to shape it. We need to understand that theater is affecting, but that's the whole reason that we have it. Ming Pfeiffer, Pfeiffer wrote a play called Usual Girls. It was around about a couple years ago. And in this play, it is about the journey of a mixed race, half white, half Asian woman who is growing up in Ohio in the 80s, very much like she did. But in the play, it takes place over a number of years from elementary school all throughout adulthood and tracks the journey related to sex and race of this girl into woman. And the play has elementary school kids talking about sex, middle school kids enacting what they think sex is with each other. And those sorts of things, if you see them in a content warning, might want people to be pushed away, even people who have maybe traumas related to it. But she mentioned that I think the whole experience of the audience being comfortable, then suddenly being very uncomfortable, which for me is the experience of rape and the experience of sexual abuse and the experience of growing up female-bodied, female-presenting in this world. So often your sexuality is yours, until it's taken away from you. So the whole experience is to not see it coming as well. And she talks about people coming up to her after the shows who disclose extremely personal things about their own lives and are affected by this play. Not only allows people who have not had these experiences to gain empathy for people who have, but also people who have these sorts of experiences to know that they are not alone and to be able to receive empathy and be seen. And that is extremely important for theater. And if people are put off by a content advisory, that doesn't happen. Additionally, they invite censorship, both of external and internal. There was a play called Bezdi by Gurpreet Kaur, who, and I apologize for mispronouncing that name, I'm sure I did. She is a Sikh British woman who wrote a play that has a rape inside of a Sikh temple in it. This play was protested by members of the Sikh community in Birmingham, England, who did not ever see the play. They were objecting to it on sacrilegious grounds. And the protests became more and more, even leaning into violence and vandalism. The theater company talked to various Sikh leaders in Birmingham and asked, about where this might lead. The religious leaders, the community leaders said that they could not guarantee that it wouldn't get even more and more violent. And so because of the responses to this act that they thought was sacrilegious, this play was canceled 2 weeks in. Now, to be fair, this was not because of a content warning that they heard this. I do want to make that clear. But it is from people who did not see the show. And issuing a content warning absent context or absent someone actually seeing it is maybe just giving people matches to burn it down. In addition, internally, if you're a playwright and you're writing a play, ideally, you're going to let the ideas come to you as they do and not censor yourself at the same time as you're brainstorming. But if you have a list of topics that you need to be careful with, that is going to inhibit, even subconsciously, what you're writing, which would, it would kind of neuter the art that you're creating. Content warnings can also be confusing. Even in practice, they might obfuscate rather than illuminate. If I went to see a production that had this content advisory: pervasive drug use, extended periods of intoxication, sexual assault, threats of rape, implied group sex and bestiality, enslavement, references to forced marriage, kidnapping, child endangerment, and war, anti-blackness, Orientalism, white supremacy, misogyny, patriarchy, prejudice toward the working class, body horror, and an onstage depiction of suicide with scenes of violence, including intimate partner violence. Now, if I saw that content description, even if I, as a savvy theater goer, know that the script of A Midsummer Night's Dream contains these, which it does, reading that would signal to me not just a kind of a sterile description, but it would lead me to believe that the production leans into those things. This is a play that is done routinely by middle schools, right? And it would give me the wrong impression, perhaps, of what this play actually is, even though it contains those. It would give me the wrong impression. Content warnings also reinforce a dominant reading of the text in a couple of ways. They, by stating what might be objectionable, they imply a certain audience that is assumed to be the correct audience. I'll give an example. Let's say if a content warning says this play includes blasphemy, right? That implies that the intended audience might have religious beliefs that make blasphemy a thing. If someone does not think blasphemy actually exists, they might think, well, okay, this might not be the play for me. In addition, I got into an argument with a professor in graduate school about the ending of a play called Thérèse Raquin by Émile Zola. Right. So Laurent and Thérèse are lovers. They end up murdering Camille, who's Thérèse's husband. But they don't find the body, and they're worried that he's going to come back. But at the end, this is the end of the play. They slowly turn to face each other. She sees the vial of poison. He sees the knife. Do it. No, you. Thérèse puts down the knife. As if hypnotized, Laurent pours the rest of the vial into the bottle of wine. Laurent drinks from the bottle, letting it spill ecstatically over his face and head, hands the bottle to Thérèse. She drinks with the same abandon, soaking herself. They look at each other as they regard each other, and as character 3 waits for character 4, who doesn't appear, the lights fade to black. Okay, so they are obviously trying to kill themselves here. I contended in this graduate level class, this play does not contain a suicide, because there is a curtain and they are still alive. In order to have a suicide, you have to have a death. This play does not have a death, therefore it doesn't have a suicide. He disagreed. He said, no, this play absolutely does have a suicide, because the suicide is the act of killing yourself, not the dying itself. And they do absolutely have that in the play. So we were arguing back and forth whether or not this play actually contains X or Y, right? If Zola wanted that definitively answered, he would have put it here. But if I were to have a content warning that said, this play contains suicide, right? That argument is meaningless. If it says, this play contains an attempted suicide, I mean, technically, in order to commit suicide, you have to attempt it. But that those words imply that it's unsuccessful. And this play contains suicidal activity doesn't seem right either. Anything you do just kind of muddies the waters and implies that there is a correct answer and that the correct reading is not an ambiguous one. Alongside of that, just spoilers are bad. I know this is a controversial opinion. Spoilers are bad. There is a play called Request Concert by Franz Xavier Kretz. It is about an hour long. It doesn't have any dialogue in it. It is just one woman who comes home and she just goes through her nightly routine and then goes to bed. Right? She's the only character on stage. The only other character is a radio DJ that she puts on who is doing the request concert. So the play ends with her putting in her curlers, going to bed. And then at the very end, these things happen. She wakes up, goes to the bathroom, comes back out, and then takes out some sleeping pills. Takes one, looks at the dosage sheet. Then she dumps all the pills out, sorts them, takes them one by one until her water is gone, goes toward the sink, thinks about it, goes toward the refrigerator instead, takes out more wine, or actually wine, fills up her glass, takes the rest of the sleeping pills. So this play ends with an attempt at probably a suicide. Now, for the previous hour, you don't know this is going to happen. The whole point of the play is to not know that a suicide is in it, so that when that happens, you look back and say, oh my goodness, I did not see this. If you know a suicide is going to happen, that reaction will not be there. The whole point is to not know there's a suicide in this play, because you will be looking, oh, that means she's going to kill herself. That means she's going to kill herself. That means, no, that's not the correct reading of the play. That's not the intended reading. Spoilers are bad. Spoilers or content warnings also remove context, right? Let's say you're reading Dutchman by Amiri Baraka, and you come to about 90% through. There are two characters, Clay, who is a black man in his 20s, and Lola, who's a white woman in her 30s, right? And they have kind of a flirtation, but it turns a little bit weird and icky when she starts kind of bringing race and kind of racially abusing him. This is part of a long speech where he talks about Charlie Parker. If he would have just walked up to East 67th Street and killed the first 10 white people he saw, not a note. And I'm the great would-be poet. Yes, that's right, poet. Some kind of bastard literature. All it needs is a simple knife thrust. Just let me bleed you, you loud whore, and one poem vanished. A whole people of neurotics struggling to keep from being sane. And the only thing that would cure the neuroses would be your murder. Simple as that. I mean, if I murdered you, then other white people would begin to understand me. Out of context, this is genocide and terrorism. Out of context, it is. He is advocating, he is talking about killing a white person so other people will understand. That's terrorism. But in context, if you read the play, it is not that. After being abused for so long, not just by this other woman, but also by society, forced to kind of mold him into things that he's not. I mean, the character's name is Clay, for crying out loud. He has this kind of pushback. And this speech is defense. This is not offense so much. It is a pressure that is exploding a little bit. And so a content warning that calls this terrorism or genocide removes the whole context, because that's not really what it is. Also, the legal argument works the other way as well. If you have a tort, if someone sues you for intentional infliction of emotional distress, one of the prongs is foreseeability. And foreseeability matters, right? You can't tell an audience, hey, we understand that you may feel threatened by this play, but we're going to do it, and not also tell a judge, hey, we knew that they would feel threatened, but we did it anyway. Like, you can't do that. You are building their case for them. There are also critiques from the left saying that content warnings really make other warnings not there, right? They might be a fig leaf for other concern. Marley Grayson, a researcher in the realm of academia, but I think it applies, says just as the DSM-5 identifies the individual as a primary subject of analysis in defining, diagnosing, and treating trauma, much so-called trauma-informed practices emphasize responding more appropriately to individual pathology, despite research suggesting greater benefits of approaches that connect individual experience to social systems that give rise to trauma and oppression. In doing so, such trauma-informed, she says pedagogies, but let's say practices, keep the structures that perpetuate trauma, such as the very institutions in which they are practiced, firmly in place. A content warning frames harm as individual, right? Where the conflict exists is one person's relationship to the material. But that might not be the best place to frame that harm. Birth of a Nation, it would be harder to critique that if you were only looking at an individual reaction. And a content warning frames harm as individual. And so broader social critiques of a play might be harder to make. And in addition, institution-wise, if someone puts a content warning on something, they might think, hey, you know, our job is done, right? We are accessible, we are open to everybody. But even maybe not putting energy into the own institution structures that might perpetuate these things too. Finally, there is evidence that they don't even work. Some researchers, Sanson, Strange, and Gary, again in the academic sphere, gave research participants, undergrads, because stories that had instances of sexual assault in them. Some of them had trigger warnings, some of them did not. And they later interviewed the participants, and there was, and the result was trigger warnings had trivial effects. People reported similar levels of negative affect, intrusions, and avoidance, regardless of whether they had received a trigger warning. Moreover, these patterns were similar among people with a history of trauma. These results suggest a trigger warning is neither meaningfully helpful nor harmful. Now, understanding that in order to make that leap from education to art, it is by analogy, it is by implication, it is not actually the thing, but I do not understand a difference in why it would not also apply to theater. So even in the narrowest, best argument, they don't even work. So where are we? I'm not sure. I still don't know where I stand. I think at the end of the day, it is not which arguments are good or which arguments are not. I think really where you stand depends on the values that you bring to the table, right? Do you value consent more than integrity? I don't know. Do you value freedom of speech more than you value not harming people? I don't know. It might be different for each individual show. But even though I haven't landed on a specific synthesis, I hope I've gone halfway to proposing a solution by describing the problem. So I want to thank you all for coming. That is all I have. So thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Oh, it's 1 o'clock.
Questions? We're running a bit late, but kind of interesting stuff.
Yes.
Gary, use the microphone.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Two quick observations. Number one, you began by saying you're really hedging. Number two, at the very end of your talk here, you kind of connected it to education, not just the theater.
Mm-hmm.
And my question, therefore, is, you're going to have to give me a yes or no answer on this. Do you use trigger warnings in your classes where you're teaching about, among other things, trigger warnings?
Sure. And that's a very good question. A number of these plays I have used as reference points in classrooms. The syllabi that I have currently do have some content advisories in them. I will say that is before a lot of the research that I did. And so I have not created any syllabi after. I have discovered that I don't know where I stand. But currently mine do.
I'll ask a question.
Yes.
The trigger warnings have only come in relatively recently. And I wonder what your opinion is of this. All those years, let's say since Shakespeare's time.
Right.
All those centuries since Shakespeare, and we weren't being given trigger warnings about the murders and the suicides and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
And the violence. Is that because people then didn't need them because they were less fragile, or is that because people were less sensitive to the possible dangers?
Well, I think there's a number of reasons. I think that kind of awareness of mental health issues has grown. So it may not be that harm is greater now. It might just be awareness of that harm. I will also say, certainly in the Western tradition, from Shakespeare on, a number of theoreticians ascribe to this conception of theater called neoclassicism, where one of its tenets was that, going back to the ancient Greeks where violence was not on stage, thinking that people should act with a kind of decorum, and there should be kind of a propriety to what goes on stage. And so there certainly was a dominant hegemonic idea that these things just should not be there to begin with. So I think it is a little bit of both. Another kind of related thing to this would be intimacy directors, intimacy coordinators, whether or not those were needed in the past in theater and in film. There are certainly situations where you can look back and say, if they were here, that would have been beneficial. But in most cases, there doesn't seem to be an issue. So I think it might be a little bit of both. There also were studies that I ran across saying that trigger warnings are associated with distrust of institutions about whether people want them. And so I think institutional breakdown in many parts of society in the last few decades has maybe contributed to the desire for them. And so I think there are a lot of reasons. I don't think it's easy to point to one thing.
Good, thank you.
Hi, so I teach psychology, and I was trying to apply this to things like syllabi in classrooms, and I don't have content warnings on my syllabi because you're in college and things are going to be uncomfortable. And you know, I teach a class on death, and I'm like, listen, the title is the trigger, right?
Right.
I will, however, on certain classes say, you know, listen, I have a video, it's going to have flashing lights. If you have epilepsy, look away. But I'm also a parent. And so I have asked many of the theater students, you know, can you tell me about the play so I know whether I can bring my kids?
Sure.
Because I'm still that parent that's like, you're not going to watch Deadpool, you're too young, you're
Right.
too, you know,
Sure.
I'm still that parent. Do you also find kind of this bifurcation of your own opinion depending on what role you are playing? If you are a director, a parent, a teacher, and does that have influence on whether you think content warning should be in one place and not the other?
Yes, I find when I am framing myself, when I'm looking at this argument as a parent, certainly. So I have a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old, almost 3 in just a couple of days. I certainly do anything that they watch on TV. There are certain things that, you know, I pre-screen. I make sure that this is okay, even if a rating is something. Seems to be the same. I do that. And I am glad for, you know, content advisories on, you know, Netflix or whatever. It does say things like, I mean, I think they're a little bit different than rating systems, but kind of similar. This is, you know, for people under 7 because it contains X, Y, and Z. And I am very thankful for that. I feel like as a parent, it does help me make those kinds of decisions. But on the other hand, as a theater artist, who, you know, for most of my life, with very few exceptions, did art for, you know, intending that the audience is adults. I know very much that I would be pulling my punch a little bit, and the play would be less effective. And even as someone who is an actor, right, and who has done directing as well, and directed other playwrights' things, there is an element of adding text to the work if I put a content warning on it. And there seems to be a little, you know, there's a slight sense of betrayal of the playwright. Because if they wanted that as a part of the audience's experience, they would have put it there, right? And some do, right? There are a number of theater practitioners who talk about what is going to go on in their play. Bertolt Brecht is the kind of big example of saying, this is what is going to happen. And so instead of the audience kind of thinking that they're going on a journey of discovery and kind of going along, they can say, okay, I know what's going to happen, so I'm going to look back and see how and why this thing happens. So there are playwrights that do kind of similar things as content themselves. But yeah, that is why I'm of two minds. I do not know ultimately where I land, and it does change depending on the framing that I give myself. Oh, okay. I'll try to have very quick answers.
Well, thank you. So I'm really curious, you mentioned using content warning kind of on your syllabi.
Huh.
I work in the libraries, and this kind of discussion has come up a lot about harmful language and the like. And I was curious what the student reaction, if there was one, to those warnings was, if it was appreciated, if it invited conversation with them.
To be honest, when I do when those content warnings are given in my classes, they are typically kind of at the beginning, right? Of course they are. And just the nature of how they have gone, I have not kind of stopped and had a discussion of them. I have not specifically had feedback to that effect, specifically on my syllabi. I have had students say, we don't need that, right? Like, you know, I live life going through like trauma. And so why would it be different in this class? But there are students who seem to appreciate it a bit. I did have a student that I taught at one point refuse to read a couple of plays because she found the content going against her religious beliefs. And so in that way, I know that she appreciated that. Do I think she should have read them? Yeah, I do. But I know that from her perspective, she did appreciate it.
Last very quick question, very quick answer.
Thanks a lot for this. I'm interested in the word trigger. A
Sure.
trigger is a metaphor, and it's refers to things not just PTSD, which is a problematic term in itself, but it refers to the whole array of words that I've been writing about called gunspeak. And it, in our incredibly violent, dangerous society where you never know whether something's going to break out or not, and somebody's going to start shooting, trigger alerts people to this whole risk and danger in ways that are often subtle and they're not aware of, which is, to me, is a good argument for not using trigger warnings, but rather the other advisory. Anyway, thank you.
Sure, and I think that absolutely, you know, a trigger on the gun is not the harm itself, but it causes an inevitable, sudden, harmful thing. And so I can understand why that metaphor is used. I can also understand why having metaphors for firearms and weaponry within our kind of normal everyday speech is not great. And so I do take that point. And that would be another reason to use content instead of trigger, just because of the origins and connotations of that word. Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you, Jonathan. Let's give Jonathan another round of
All right.
applause.
Well, thank you all very much. Yes.